There's magic in simplicity, a rainy night, a good story, and a warm voice that's all you need. Before we begin, click like if this is your kind of calm, and subscribe for more sleepy escapes. Do you remember the last bedtime story someone read to you? Sundays always began the same way, slowly, like the world had agreed to move just a little softer for a while. I'd wake to the sound of the kettle starting its low hum in the kitchen, and through the half-open door I could hear the soft clink of a teaspoon against ceramic, the sound of my father stirring sugar into his coffee. He never used a machine, just the old enamel pot on the stove and the same chip mug he'd had for as long as I could remember. The house was quiet then, the kind of quiet that feels warm rather than empty. My mother usually stayed in bed a little longer on Sundays, so it was just him and me in those first early hours, though we rarely spoke. I'd come out in my pajamas, hair sticking up in strange angles, and he'd look at me over the rim of his cup with that same small nod he always gave, a kind of silent good morning. There was a rhythm to it, his presence, the way the kitchen smelled of toast and slightly burnt coffee grounds, the hum of the old fridge, and, though nothing ever happened on those mornings, they settled into me in a way I never quite noticed until years later. Sometimes he'd open the window, even in winter, just a crack, just enough to let the cold in and remind us both that time was moving, that the world outside still existed. He'd say something like, "Smells like snow," or "It's too quiet out there," and I'd nod back. Not because I understood, but because I wanted to. He wasn't a man of long explanations. He showed things more than he said them. After coffee, he'd sometimes go out to the shed to fix something, or just to tinker with old tools that didn't need fixing anymore. On those days, I'd follow him out there, still in slippers, standing in the doorway like a shadow. He never asked why I was there, and I never gave a reason. But he'd let me hand him things: a screwdriver, a rag, a worn-out box of nails, and in that simple exchange, something passed between us. Not instruction exactly, more like quiet permission to be beside him. Those Sundays taught me something I didn't have the words for back then, that love doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like quiet routines, shared space, the same mug placed in the same spot, the feel of cool air against your face while someone you trust stands beside you and says almost nothing at all. It was a Sunday like any other, cold outside, the windows slightly fogged from the heat of the kitchen meeting the bite of winter air. But something felt a little different, though I didn't know how to name it at the time. I remember waking up and finding my father already in the kitchen, standing instead of sitting, leaning against the counter with his coffee untouched beside him. He didn't notice me at first, or maybe he did, but chose not to break the silence. There was a look in his eyes that I now know is far away, the kind of look people wear when they're not in the room but drifting somewhere else entirely, back in time maybe, or forward into worry. I shuffled in, still small enough to feel unsure in my own skin, and sat quietly at the table, my legs swinging just above the floor. Eventually, he joined me, the chair creaking under his weight, and we sat there like we always did, just the two of us, and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. He stirred his coffee once, twice, but didn't drink it. I don't remember what I said, something small, something ordinary, about the way the frost looked on the window, or a dream I'd had, and he nodded, the way he always did, but slower this time. more like a wait than a response. Then, after a long pause, he looked down at his hands and said, so softly I almost missed it, my father used to sit like this too. That was all. No story. No follow-up. Just a sentence that felt like a doorway he opened, then gently closed again. I didn't ask questions. I didn't know how. But I remember how the room felt after that, heavier, somehow, and more meaningful. As if I'd been invited into something sacred without even realizing it. He finished his coffee eventually, in small sips, and we went on with the day as usual, a short walk, the radio playing low in the background, maybe the sound of him sorting tools out in the shed. But that sentence stayed with me. It still does. It was the first time I saw my father not just as my father, but as someone else's son. Someone shaped by quiet mornings of his own, by silences passed down through generations like rituals. And it made me realize even then, even as a boy, that sometimes the most important things aren't said to explain, but to leave a thread between two hearts, one that waits to be followed when you're ready. It wasn't something I tried to do, at least not on purpose, but somewhere along the way, I began to move like him, especially on Sundays. I'd wake a little earlier than I needed to, pad into the kitchen in socked feet, and reach for the same chipped kettle we'd used for years. By then, I was making the coffee. My father would already be outside, usually in the garden or leaning over the hood of the car with his sleeves rolled up, even if there wasn't much that needed fixing. He always found something to check, some reason to stay busy with his hands, and I think now it was never really about the task. It was about the steadiness of it, the comfort of being useful, even in silence. I'd fill the mugs, 2 of them, and leave his by the back door where he could find it. Sometimes we'd sit together like we always had, not saying much, the steam from our cups drifting in opposite directions. Other times, he'd nod toward the shed or the yard, and I'd follow, wordlessly falling into step beside him. It was around then I noticed I had started to breathe differently on Sundays, slower, more like him. I didn't check my phone as much. I didn't feel the need to be anywhere else. There was something about those mornings, that in-between time when the world still felt half asleep, that made me want to linger. I began keeping small habits of his without realizing it. Wiping down the counter even when it looked clean. Folding the dish towel the way he did. Organizing tools in the shed by size, even though they'd be moved again next week. There was no announcement, no moment where he said, "You're ready now." But I think he saw it, the shift, the way I began to move through the space, not as a guest in his world, but as someone who was slowly beginning to shape his own one that looked in small, quiet ways a lot like his. And on one particular Sunday, as we both stood in the doorway with our mugs in hand, watching a soft rain begin to fall across the lawn, he looked at me and said, with just the faintest smile, "You do things the right way." It wasn't praise, exactly. It was recognition. And it settled in me like warmth, because what he meant wasn't about coffee or tools or tidiness. It was about presence, about rhythm, about having learned how to move gently through a day without needing to explain yourself. That was the real inheritance, and it had arrived without anyone naming it. I remember the Sunday that felt different, not because of anything loud or obvious, but because something beneath the surface had shifted, like a familiar song that suddenly played in a different key. It had rained the night before, the kind of soft, soaking rain that leaves the world smelling clean and tired. I came into the kitchen expecting the usual coffee already brewing, the soft scrape of the chair, my father's calm presence waiting at the table. But he wasn't there. The kettle was cold, the window still fogged. I found him out back instead, sitting on the old wooden steps in his slippers, elbows resting on his knees, staring out across the damp lawn like he wasn't really seeing it. I stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure whether to speak or retreat, but something about the way his shoulders sagged kept me rooted. "Everything all right?" I asked, and he nodded a small, tired gesture but didn't speak. So I sat down beside him. For a long time we didn't say anything, just listened to the slow dripping of water from the gutter and the occasional creak of the fence in the breeze. Then, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, he said, "Your uncle called last night. They think your grandfather's not got much time." I felt the words hit and settle, like dust across a surface that's been undisturbed for years. It took me a moment to realize he wasn't just telling me news. He was telling me something he didn't quite know how to carry. "I thought I'd be ready," he said, still not looking at me. "But I don't know what ready even means." That was all. No tears. No explanation. Just the quiet admission of a man who had spent a lifetime being the steady one. And in that stillness, I saw him fully, not as the father who brewed coffee and fixed loose hinges, but as the son who was now standing where I would someday stand. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. I just sat there beside him, our shoulders almost touching, and let the silence do what it needed to. Eventually, we went inside. I made the coffee. He took the first sip and said, "Too strong," like he always did when he needed to return to something familiar. And we sat at the table like we always had, the light soft through the window, the air quiet, the world not fixed, but momentarily at peace. That morning taught me that presence is not always about holding things together. Sometimes it's just about sitting next to someone when they can't. It took time more than I expected for Sundays to feel like mine again after he was gone. Not gone in the sudden dramatic way stories often end, but in the slow, quiet way life makes space again after someone who mattered deeply steps out of it. The kind of absence that doesn't crash through the door but instead lingers in the corners of the room, in the way the morning light falls on the table, in the soft echo of a chair being pulled out. That first Sunday I spent alone in the house, I woke early out of habit, before the world stirred. The kettle sat untouched on the stove, and for a long while I just stood there, unsure whether to move or wait, as if part of me was still expecting the shuffle of his footsteps, the clearing of his throat, the rustle of a newspaper being unfolded. But the silence stayed. Not cold, not cruel, just complete. I reached for the kettle eventually, filled it with water, and set it on the stove like I'd watched him do 100 times. I used the same coffee grounds, the same chip mug, placed in the same spot, and for the first time, I understood that these weren't just routines, they were quiet ways of honoring something that had shaped me. The coffee tasted a little off that morning, too strong maybe, or too thin, it didn't matter. I sat in his chair and let the steam rise toward the window where the light was just beginning to touch the sill. And there, in that ordinary moment, I felt something settle. Not relief, not sadness, but a kind of calm, like I was still part of something that hadn't ended. because what I'd learned from him wasn't how to brew coffee or fold towels just right. It was how to show up for the day gently, how to let quiet mean something, how to make space for someone without needing to speak it out loud. That morning, I didn't feel alone. I felt accompanied, not by a ghost or memory exactly, but by a presence made of habit, of love lived consistently over time. And as I took another sip and looked out toward the quiet backyard, I thought, maybe this is how we carry people with us. Not in big, loud ways, but in the way we rise, make coffee, and wait for the light to come in. It was a quiet Sunday, like most had become by then, and I had fallen into my own rhythm kettle on, radio playing low, window cracked open just enough to let the morning air drift in like memory. I wasn't expecting company, but a friend had called the night before tired, a little frayed at the edges, the kind of tired that isn't about sleep, but about holding too much for too long, and I told her to come by if she needed. She showed up just after 9, wrapped in a sweater too big for her frame, eyes shadowed from a week she hadn't yet named out loud. I didn't ask questions. I just pointed toward the chair across from me and said, "Coffee's coming." She nodded, grateful in that quiet way people are when they've run out of language. I moved around the kitchen like I always did, but slower, more mindful, realizing partway through that I was doing everything the way he used to, placing her mug in the same spot he once placed mine, letting the silence stretch wide but soft. She sat curled into herself for a while, sipping slowly, staring at the window where the branches outside swayed gently like they were listening. We didn't talk much, and that seemed to be exactly what she needed. At one point, I glanced over and saw her shoulders begin to drop just slightly, the way mine used to. When I sat across from my father and felt that unspoken sense of safety, like the day didn't need to be fixed, only held. And in that moment, something inside me quietly clicked into place. I realized I wasn't just remembering him, I was continuing him. Not in his words, but in the shape of the space I now knew how to make for others. The gentleness, the patience, the quiet willingness to let someone just be. She stayed for about an hour, thanked me softly, and left with a kind of calm in her step that hadn't been there when she arrived. And as I washed the mugs and let the water run warm over my hands, I smiled, not at something I'd done, but at something I'd become. Without trying, without planning, I had become what he once was for me, a quiet place to land. It came back to me one afternoon without warning, not in a dream, not through a photo, but while I was folding laundry of all things, smoothing the corners of a towel in the same quiet way he used to. And suddenly, there it was, a memory I hadn't touched in decades. I must have been no older than 7, sitting at the kitchen table one rainy Sunday, arms crossed, frustrated about something small, maybe a lost toy, or being told I couldn't go outside. I remember huffing loudly, in the way kids do when they want to be noticed without asking directly, and my father was at the counter, buttering toast with the kind of patience that made it seem like nothing in the world was rushed. He didn't look at me, didn't lecture, or try to cheer me up. He simply took one of the toast slices and without a word, cut it diagonally, something he never did, and placed it on a little plate in front of me. 2 perfect triangles. And then he walked back to his seat, took a sip of his coffee, and went on with his morning as if nothing had happened. But I remember it now so clearly, how that one small gesture softened something in me, how the act of changing a habit, cutting toast differently, was his way of saying, I see you. I may not have the words, but I see you. And I think that's what made him so steady, so quietly remarkable. He didn't try to fix every mood. He didn't fill the air with explanations. He just noticed things when someone needed space, or closeness, or just a little triangle of comfort when the world didn't feel right. Folding the towel that day, I sat down at the table afterward and looked at the light coming through the window, and I could almost see him there, calm and silent, turning small, unnoticed moments into a language I'm only now beginning to understand. A language of noticing, of adjusting, of loving in ways that don't need applause. And I realized the most important things aren't always taught. Sometimes they're just offered quietly, again and again, until one day we find ourselves offering them too. There are still Sundays when I forget, when I wake late or fill the morning with noise, when the quiet slips past me and the day unfolds too fast. But even then, something small always finds its way back, the way the light lands on the counter, the feel of the mug in my hand, the instinct to open the window just a little and breathe the air before it warms. It's in those moments I feel him most, not like a ghost, not like something lost, but like something folded gently into the way I move through the world. He's in the way I sit across from someone and let silence be enough. He's in the careful way I place two mugs on a table. He's in the pause I take before offering advice, the steadiness I've come to value more than certainty. These aren't things I meant to carry. They're just there now, like breath, like pulse. And I think that's what love becomes. If it was given patiently enough, not a story we have to tell, but a rhythm that keeps beating long after the moment has passed. I used to think legacy was something big, something spoken in eulogies or etched in stone, but now I see it in quieter places, in folded towels, in buttered toast, in early mornings when the kettle hums and the world hasn't quite decided what kind of day it's going to be. He never told me how to live, not directly. He just lived in a way that left space for me to learn by watching. And now, when I stand in the same kitchen, in the same silence, I understand. He was never trying to be remembered. He was just trying to be there. And maybe that's the best we can offer anyone. Not a perfect life, not all the right words, but presence. Something calm, something certain, something that says, you're safe here. Even now, all these years later, when I close my eyes on a quiet Sunday and listen to the stillness between moments, I swear I can still hear him stirring his coffee just once or twice before the day begins.